on to more serious matters, and that is the matter of cybersecurity. James Paterson is a Liberal senator and he's chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. He joins us now. Good morning, James Paterson.
Good morning, David.
Senator, how often is there a cyber attack here in this country?
Well, there's one reported every 32 minutes to the Cybersecurity Centre at the Australian Signals Directorate. That's to a critical infrastructure provider like an electricity network or a water supplier or a bank. But there's one every 8 minutes reported more generally across our society. And the frightening thing is that we think that's a significant underreporting because as it stands in Australia, we have no mandatory obligation on businesses to report to the government if they're under a cyber attack. So we suspect that's just the tip of the iceberg.
So what constitutes a cyber attack?
That's a good question. It can be a whole range of things. It can be anything from a denial of service attack where a server is bombarded with a number of requests in a way that disables that website from operating, to a phishing scam where someone receives an email that contains a compromised link that might seek to, for example, install ransomware on a network, to much less visible but dormant presences on our critical infrastructure network providers that might be lying in wait, might be pre-positioned for future use by a nation-state adversary.
So why aren't things grinding to a halt?
That's a good question. I mean, it does cost billions of dollars every year to Australian citizens and businesses, and it has a very real impact. But our greatest fear is that in peacetime, this is something which can be debilitating for regional companies or citizens. But in an era of conflict that we may be moving closer towards, it could be debilitating for our society at large if an adversary sought to weaken us or disable us internally to prevent us from projecting our power into the region or coming to the aid of our friends or allies.
Is there a sense of people who want to do this sort of stuff that they don't actually want to bring it down today? They're just testing where the weak points are, and so our water system hasn't stopped working. The traffic lights are still working. The lights are still on. There was never a serious attempt to bring them down. It's just a case of, we can do this, we can do that. We're testing it and probing it. So when we want to, we can.
Different players in this space have different motivations. If you're a ransomware gang operating out of Eastern Europe, your motivation is primarily financial and you're looking to extort money out of a business or an individual. If you're a nation state, it is much more likely that you are doing exactly what you described, probing and testing weaknesses constantly across a whole range of systems in the event that you might need to use that in your advantage in the future.
Right. So you might have in your program something that identifies a weakness but doesn't actually bring about the fault, because if you brought about the fault, you'd be alerting the sovereign state to a problem. So you're just testing it.
That's right, but we also had quite a troubling recent example with the Microsoft Exchange compromise, where we've now engaged in public attribution to the Chinese government's exploitation of that weakness, where it appears that the Ministry of State Security in China and other actors advertised that weakness and made it available more widely to criminal gangs and effectively allowed that weakness to be weaponised for criminal gain as well as for nation-state espionage.
Okay, now in a moment we'll talk to Vanessa Teague. She's the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity and Associate Professor at the Australian National University. What does she make of all this? But Senator Paterson joins us. He is the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and they are looking at this problem and they've decided that we need some laws. Senator Paterson, can you explain what have you been looking at that we need, you say, to better protect us?
So we've been referred a piece of legislation to beef up protections for critical infrastructure, and it contains a range of recommendations from emergency powers for the Australian Signals Directorate to effectively step in and direct an entity if it was unwilling or unable to respond to a cyber attack in the event of a very serious attack, to obligations on business themselves to invest more and prepare themselves and mitigate those risks as much as possible. It's a very ambitious, comprehensive bill, and the committee has made a recommendation that those emergency powers, including those mandatory reporting obligations, should be very swiftly legislated by the Parliament, and that what are called the positive security obligations, which would impose a regulatory cost, a compliance cost on business, should be deferred while they undergo ongoing consultation and design, and should be put forward in a separate second bill.
So can you tease that out, though? What does that mean? If there was a cyber attack, say on SA Water and the private companies that are managing our water system here in South Australia for SA Water, if there was a cyber attack on them, under your laws, the utility would have to let the Signals Directorate know immediately. Well, you'd think they'd do it anyway. Why wouldn't they? And the Signals Directorate would have the ability to move in and take over SA Water's operations? Because what do they know about running a water system?
The good news is that we have a relatively high degree of cooperation already from those systemically important businesses with the Signals Directorate. However, we are aware of at least one example of a systemically important private sector business which was under a very serious cyber attack, which not only failed to notify the Signals Directorate that it was under attack, but after the Signals Directorate learned about the attack through media reporting, it then resisted engagement and assistance from the Signals Directorate, even though it was incapable itself of dealing with that very serious cyber attack. And that cyber attack did have implications for its customers and ultimately the wider Australian economy. We can't have a situation...
Can you tell us who that was?
No, I can't.
Because it's like a national security secret.
Well, I was briefed in a classified setting about that scenario, and I'm not at liberty to declassify on a radio program as much as I'd like to.
No, fair enough. Can you tell us what sector the attack was?
I can tell you it was a critical infrastructure provider, and it was systemically important, and its failure had ongoing consequences for both its immediate clients but also the wider Australian public. And this was just one attack on one provider. If it had been coordinated at scale across a range of providers, then it could be extremely debilitating.
And the reluctance from the provider to tell the Australian Signals Directorate what was going on was because it would affect their operations. It might attract attention that would affect their share price or their business.
It's not clear because the cybersecurity centre that sits within the ASD is extremely adept at working with private sector providers, protecting their privacy and their security and providing them with useful advice about how to respond to attacks like this. And they're particularly helpful in doing so for companies that are less sophisticated, that don't have the resources to have a very robust cybersecurity team internally. So it is surprising that you wouldn't have cooperation, and this is the exception. The rule is generally we do have a high level of cooperation, but we think in the event of emergency, this last resort power is necessary because unfortunately there might be other companies who find themselves in similar circumstances.
James Paterson, one of the problems must be that the Parliament, how many people in the Parliament would actually understand this stuff? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the technical aspects are highly complex and difficult to understand, but the legal aspects are equally difficult and complex to understand, and it is usually only the relevant ministers and perhaps shadow ministers and the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is briefed to a sufficiently high level to understand the threat environment and to be able to make recommendations about it. Most other parliamentarians are at a loss to understand it and have to take us at our word when we say that we think the situation is sufficiently serious that it warrants prompt action.
So your job is to get on radio programs like ours and write editorial pieces for newspapers to convince people, trust us, we know what we're doing. That's basically in the end what we've got to do.
That's part of the job, but equally important part of my job is to scrutinise proposals that the government puts forward, to hear evidence from a range of people who those proposals would affect, and to make a balancing judgment about the implications for those organisations and individuals and the national interest.
So when will this legislation be voted on?
Well, that's up to government now. They need to respond to the recommendations made by the committee, and my advice to government is to seek to pass the first bill containing the emergency provisions as soon as possible.
All right. if you've just joined us, and we're going to wrap it up now, but what we've been talking about is this bill recommended by this parliamentary committee to create new powers and new rules which companies, small and large, and utilities run by governments would have to abide by if they were under a cyber attack. And apparently one of these cyber attacks happens in this country every few minutes. So everybody agrees we are very, very vulnerable, but there's a lot of debate over what to do next. So, James Paterson, thank you for your time.
Thank you for your interest.